Chuck Morse. My guest is Robert Roselli. He is the author. He's the author of "Pleased to Meet You," which is a fictionalized book available at Amazon.com. And I guess, in a nutshell, Robert, you deal with the what we might euphemistically call the satanic influence in history. Is that right?
That's pretty much correct. And first of all, thanks for having me on. And just for reference, I mean, the website's boxofsunglasses.com. That's one word, and the books and everything are available there. But anyway, but yeah, to answer your question, in a broad sense, yes. I mean, if you're a Christian, then you believe that, and it is true. Satanic influence over the world, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And let me just say this, and just to kind of fast forward. I mean, really fast forward till today. We can see the satanic influence on the back of our so-called Federal Reserve notes, that unfinished pyramid with that stone eye, that triangular eye looking at all of us from our so-called money, which are really instruments of debt. So you can pretty much bridge our so-called modern financial system, an impending disastrous financial system, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So in a broad sense, hopefully that answers your question.
No, this is interesting. So you deal with there are two things I see here. Firstly, the question of the proper monetary system, and maybe what you say is like a fake system where you have fiat currency that's backed by, I suppose you could say nothing. Others would say the full faith and credit of the nation that issues the currency. But and that's an interesting economic question. But more specifically, you're talking about the symbolism that you say represents a satanic influence, and in this case, that would be the Great Seal of the United States, the reverse side of that Great Seal, which I don't believe was
That's
made
exactly.
available to the American people until the 1930s when it was published. So we all know the front side of the seal, which is the eagle holding the arrows and the olive branch. But the back side of the seal, I believe, first appeared on the American $1 bill. I believe it was in the early 1930s, and that is, as you say, the Egyptian pyramid with the all-seeing eye on the top as a capstone that's separated from the pyramid. So, what does that mean, and how is it that became the Great Seal of the United States?
Well, Chuck, let's just kind of um, to answer your question. Yeah, the Great Seal. I mean, it was drawn up, in around 1776. The founding of this nation. It was drawn up by a small committee of Congress, and many people whom I disagree with vehemently. Claim that, well, the founding of this nation was part of the so-called quote conspiracy that we're going to talk about, soon. But it never really went anywhere. I mean, it was drawn up and this sort of thing. But you're correct. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who was heavily into the occult, and his little-known Secretary of Agriculture, a gentleman by the name of Henry Wallace, who was even more heavily into the occult. But we won't go off on that
Mm-hmm.
tangent right now. But that's when the Great Seal did appear around in the mid 1930s, around the time of the Great Depression. But just to answer your question, now the monetary system, in a quote secular sense, yeah, it did come online in 1913. It was nothing more than a theft on a national scale. It's nothing more than a national bank robbery and a coup, as far as I'm concerned, by the so-called international bankers that everybody tells you it's quote conspiracy theory. I promise you, it is not. It's basic historical fact that our so-called modern, quote modern monetary system was founded in 1913, and not by international bankers, but when in fact it was. I mean, you can read the history. I mean, Rockefeller, Morgan, Rothschild family from interest, they were represented by Paul Warburg and others. They literally got on separate trains one night, in 1913, using pseudonyms and whatever and aliases. Went down to Jekyll Island, Georgia, drew up this scam we called the Federal Reserve System, and it was passed into law on I believe it was December 23rd, right before the Christmas recess in 1913 by our scallywag and lowlife Congress. So, the lowlifes in Congress, they were no different 100 years ago. There's still a bunch of thieving, self-serving lowlifes, but that's another story. They signed this monstrosity into law, and voila, we had the Federal Reserve System. And let me just say this, okay? I don't care, how many so-called quote experts, we listen to on TV, and these jokers and these liars, Paul Krugman and others from the New York Times and whoever, and Chicago University and Harvard Business School and MIT. They're all full of stuff. Insert the proper word for stuff, because our system, quite simply, it's a debt-based system. Okay, and it was designed like that. Okay, it was designed, with the overlay of statistics and all kinds of mathematics and theories and inflation and economy heating up and interest rates. Okay, that's all a bunch of blank. All right, because underneath it's a debt-based system that can mathematically never be paid off. Okay, so now you're starting to hopefully understand how, number one, how simple it is, and number two, why the people that drew it up had to travel in secret, travel to Jekyll Island and get it passed through Congress, and literally in the dead of night, 18 hours before Christmas Day, 1913. Okay, because at the bottom, okay, again, it is mathematically impossible to pay off the national debt. Okay, let me say that again. It's mathematically impossible to pay off our national debt. So when you hear all these, even on so-called Fox News, or so-called conservatives, these Republican scam artists talking about cutting spending and all this sort of thing, it's just not going to happen. If I'm the Federal Reserve System and I am now the new source of your money, Chuck, and you're the federal government, and I loan you money at interest, how are you going to pay me back? The only way to pay me back is to borrow, more money from me at interest, the next year. And as you can see, that's basic insanity. But that's the long and the short of it for our so-called financial system. Okay, so in other words, everything else is a lie. Now, just as an aside, this kind of explains why my favorite movie and the title of my website and all that is taken from John Carpenter's movie They Live. Okay, because it really is that simple. I need to keep repeating that. It really is that simple. Okay, it's just our economy mathematically, and I'm not a date setter. Okay, like a lot of people are, and a lot of so-called Christians trying to set dates. I don't believe in any of that, and we can get into that later on another show, whatever. But mathematically, this system must crash. Okay, again, this is an opinion. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is basic, objective math. Look, my background, my current employment, civil engineering. Okay, it's objective. It's math. That's just what it is. Okay, then again, it comes back to the next question. Well, then why was the system set up in the first place? And I'll give you the why. Obviously, the people that set it up knew what they were doing. Again, it's Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, Rothschild, and the rest of them. These so-called international bankers that everybody calls conspiracy theorists, a conspiracy theory, rather. They knew what they were doing, but the congressmen, I don't know if you had women at that time, so, whatever, be politically correct, Congress people, but whatever. they signed this into law, and the advantage for them, if you think about it, was now instead of, adhering to a gold-backed, metal-backed currency, which inherently requires discipline, because you only have so much gold, you can only produce so much money, and I'm kind of painting that whole thing with a broad brush, but anyway, the point is that it allowed them to relinquish that monetary discipline that is inherent in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that says the monetary system, the money issued by the Congress, whatever form that is in, must be backed by, whatever the weights are. They're in there, 3/8 of an ounce of silver, gold, or whatever it is. But the point is, it has to have a metal backing. So that implies a discipline. But if you come up with a system that's purely based on debt, like, again, you're the federal government, and you come up to, hey, Rob, can can I borrow, $1 billion? So, hey, here, Chuck, here's $1 billion. Oh, by the way, there's a 5% interest on it this year. Don't worry about it. And then you take that money and you go out and what do? You give it away in EBT cards and SNAP cards and welfare payments and government workers and government pensions. So what are you really doing? You're buying those people's votes. Okay, you're seducing the population. The Congress is seducing the population with quote free money, and the Congress, in turn, was seduced by the international bankers. Okay, and that's the basic history of the so-called quote Federal Reserve System. And let me just say one more thing, Chuck, and I'll get into the more the biblical side of this, but it's very interesting. Just to tie it to today's current events. Now, Donald Trump has a picture of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office.
I've noticed that, yeah.
And Andrew Jackson, I mean, he was
the
good
last
thing that he
president.
did.
I think he was one of the only leaders of any nation in modern times who actually balanced the budget, and he got rid of the central bank, the second bank of the United States. And you mentioned the Constitution and its stand on the creation of currency. You're quite right. Article 1, Section 8, I think it's Clause 3, says that Congress shall coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now, by coin money, that doesn't necessarily mean literally gold and silver coins. It just means create money. And thus Congress and our government, our national government, is supposed to, under the Constitution, create our money, create our currency based on the needs of our society and the character of our society, not a private cartel of bankers, which is what the Federal Reserve is. It's what the second bank of the United States was in Jackson's time. I mean, it goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton creating the first national bank. So central banking is not new. I don't think it's a good system. I agree with you on that. However, I don't think it's necessary that that currency be gold or gold backed. I think that and that currency can be debt based, but the debt should be to the United States, not to private bankers. The perfect example was right here in my own home state of Massachusetts, which has been the state that has originated many things around the world and many things in society. In colonial times, the state set up a land bank and or the colony of Bay Colony, and they loaned money at very low interest rates to farmers and small businessmen who could present a plan for production. And the interest would be paid to the state or the colony, which would then use the money to build infrastructure, to put in gas lights and roads. And the economy and they created the currency. I mean, it was not gold backed. It was fiat currency, but it was backed by the full faith and credit of the Bay Colony. And all of the other colonies saw the incredible success that this had, and they started imitating it as well. Like, for example, if you go to Maryland State House today, on the grounds of the State House in Annapolis is a counting room for tobacco. And tobacco was the most valuable crop in that colony at the time. So people would bring their tobacco in as collateral, and the colony would issue them currency. And that, again, was a system that worked incredibly well because the colony was governed by the people. The representatives to that government represented the people. And I think that according to legend, what happened is that Benjamin Franklin went to England for a couple of years, and he was asked by the Parliament, what is the great secret to the success of these colonies' economies? And he said they have their own money. And so the Parliament reacted to this by taking away the money and passing a law saying that only Bank of England notes and only gold and silver coin could be used to pay taxes and for commerce. And the colonies went into a depression. I think that has a lot to do. It's one of the unknown aspects of the American Revolution. And one of the first things that the Second Continental Congress did after the Declaration of Independence was they issued currency, the continental, a U.S. continental dollar. It was not backed by gold. It was backed by the full faith and credit of the government. And the reason it didn't do well is because the British counterfeited it, and they started flooding the market with counterfeits. But anyway, it's a really interesting subject for me. I actually wrote a book about it. And, I think that I meet you halfway in that I don't think that currencies should be issued by private banks. I think it should be issued by the states or by a federal government that is elected and that represents the people, because it's the people's money. It's not a private money. That doesn't mean banks shouldn't make money. They should. And that doesn't mean that the government can't lend money to banks to then lend out. And there can't be a system like that. And that's how credit unions work. But the idea of having a private cartel of bankers and investors deciding how to issue currency and then loaning it to the government and charging them money so we're paying interest on our own money, that's what is creating this huge expansion. Because, if Congress had to issue the money itself and they issued too much money, there would be an inflation and they would be booted out of office in a minute. So the restraining quality is the government itself, not necessarily gold. And also gold is a commodity and it can be manipulated by speculators, and a lot of these big bankers that we talk about, the Carnegies and whatnot, and especially JP Morgan, they used their ability and their wealth to control gold to manipulate economies and to create depressions and inflation. So while gold is always a part of a currency, it kind of is an insurance against corrupt government, and it plays a role in international trade. Gold is not, I don't think gold should be the main aspect of a currency, because gold is a commodity that could be manipulated.
Sure. I don't. I mean, you're obviously a lot more technical aspect of the subject than I do, and I'm talking more thematically. And I don't disagree that. Look, there's arguments on both sides. Does the money have to be gold backed, or can the government just issue money on a full faith and credit of the government and the people? And another example, I guess, would be Abraham Lincoln issuing greenbacks during the Civil War.
Yep.
Which
James
were not,
Madison
you know what I mean?
issued greenbacks during the War of 1812. This is not new. I mean, John F. Kennedy was talking about issuing silver certificates without the Federal Reserve that were found I think in Fort Knox or somewhere. And in fact, he was in the process of issuing those silver certificates when he was assassinated, and that was stopped. So yes, there is an ability by Franklin Roosevelt wanted to issue government currency, and then you had the bankers' coup, which didn't happen, but it was threatening enough to make him change his mind. So, the government, this has been a struggle since Washington, between the government taking responsibility as a public entity that represents the people to issue currency versus private forces, private bankers who want to go beyond their usual function and appropriate function and actually take over the right to issue currency, which is not, they should not have.
Which is what they've done with the so-called Federal Reserve System. And as anybody knows, even I think it was Dennis Kucinich, liberal Democrat from Ohio, said the Federal Reserve is as federal as Federal Express. So just inherent in the name of what a scam it is, because it's not technically federal and there are no reserves, as we've discussed.
And it's not a bank.
As far as the technical aspects of whether it's gold backed or just backed on, like as you say, like in the colonial times or Abraham Lincoln with the greenbacks, but just kind of getting back to really what I was getting at was, actually JFK was going to be my next example. That the last president that tried to issue silver coins, debt free, outside of the Federal Reserve System was JFK, and of course he wanted to pull us out of the Vietnam War, which parallels actually what Donald Trump's trying to do, taking on the Federal Reserve System and pulling us out of the
it's incredible.
Middle Eastern wars.
I pray for his safety every day. It's amazing what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
He actually thinks, Donald Trump actually believes that he is president of the United States. You know what I mean?
That's
and that's scary.
And that's a problem. And this is, JFK was acting like an actual president, and of course he was, his head was blown off in broad daylight by the only bullet in in world history that contravened fundamental rules of motion notion of Newton's laws of motion and the law of conservation of mass. As we're told to believe, a pristine bullet that had lost no particles was responsible for all the death and destruction, from between Governor Colony and JFK. I mean, it was absolutely just, again, just basic laws of science were contradicted here. But of course, to ask those questions makes you a conspiracy theorist. But let's just cut the garbage here. I mean, the real point of the Kennedy assassination was the international banking cartel. Whoever it was, the CIA front, which is the CIA is another offshoot of the international banking cartel. Or whoever killed them, it's almost irrelevant. I mean, the point was
right, and we don't really know who did. I mean, I just want to be clear. So, I think that there was some very important conspiracy work, but ultimately we don't really know. It's not been declassified. In fact, President Trump himself recently tried to declassify information about the Kennedy assassination, and let's not forget this happened already almost 50 years ago. There is no one alive today probably who was involved, so it's not a matter of national security that we can't get to the truth of it. But even in the declassification of information, he agreed with the FBI not to still release certain information, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So they're still sitting on things about this that we probably will never find out in our lifetime, and nobody may ever find out.
No, and that's probably the point. I mean, you just keep, you're just wasting people's time, and then you can say, quote, conspiracy theorists, they keep running down these rabbit holes, these endless rabbit holes, these bottomless pits, trying to figure out who it was. And I'm not sure it's that important to find out the who. Much more important is the why. I mean, it definitely wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. That was a joke. So obviously, Kennedy was killed in broad daylight as a message to future presidents. The first being LBJ, that you're going to do what we, the international bankers, tell you to do, and you're not going to take your job seriously. And of course, we've had a bunch of putzes since then, except for maybe the exception being Ronald Reagan, until Donald Trump, and fast forward to today, and this is just where we are. But look, as far as the assassinations, I mean, they tried. There was an attempt on Andrew Jackson's life. I mean, it turned out he was actually, an assassin had two single shot pistols, and both of them misfired.
Yeah.
Or else Andrew Jackson would have gone the way of JFK. Abraham Lincoln, again, John Wilkes Booth. I mean, he's kind of like the Lee Harvey Oswald. What's that?
Let me just intervene here a little bit and just mention that I actually wrote a book about this topic. I covered 31 assassination attempts in the United States, or plots, or possible conspiracies. And, we were talking about the Kennedy assassination. I don't know if you know about this one, but apparently Jimmy Carter was wanting to release the information about the Kennedy assassination and went on record of doing that. Shortly after his announcement, he was giving a speech in Los Angeles in an open forum, and there were buildings alongside the forum, and the FBI picked up these two guys who were planning on shooting him. They had heavy weapons, they had ammunition, they had everything. One of the guys was named Raymond Lee Harvey, and the other guy was named Oswaldo Munez. All right. Now, this is it. I'm not making this up. This is L.A. Times. You can look it up. It was widely publicized. Both of them were vagrants. One of them was homeless. The other was an illegal alien. They held them for a day, and then they let them go. They've never been heard from again. But that was a message to Jimmy Carter. And after that, Carter did not release the Kennedy information. And it changed his presidency. I mean, he became a different person after that in office. Right. So, I mean, these are, this goes to what we're talking about here. Now, I'm not making any accusations. I'm just reporting what was in the newspapers at the time. I mean, this is public information. Anyone can look it up.
Right. Look, and even if we wanted to make accusations and that sort of thing, I know that gets into, like legal matters, you start accusing somebody of something, but whatever. But even if we wanted to, we couldn't, because we don't know who these shadowy figures are. But exactly. I did not know that, but that's very interesting. But that just kind of buttresses my earlier point, is that the international banking cartel is sending a message to whoever the so-called president is, that you just sit there and look good, every 4 to 8 years. Throw a Democrat in there and make it look like you guys actually have elections in the United States. Throw a Republican there, like a scam artist, like the Bush family or Mitt Romney or some other scam artist, to go over there and roll over and play dead, and, be an actor. And then this is why I think we agree that Trump is attracting so much vitriol
Oh yeah,
from all sides, just because he's acting like a president, and he's not supposed to do that. My personal belief as to why they haven't just blown his head off in broad
God
daylight,
forbid, but
vis-a-vis
let's not even
JFK
think
is.
about that. And I also, I don't, I do believe that conspiracies happen all the time. Of course they do. Just like there's criminal conspiracies, there are political conspiracies. Because when there's power and when there's money and when there's advantage, you're going to have people who conspire to take advantage of that and to try to obtain it. And there are ideological conspiracies as well, like communism or Nazism. So, I mean, I think that makes an obvious amount of sense. But I want to be very careful about saying that it's international bankers or it's this group or that group, because I just don't know. And I don't think we need to try to make such accusations. We can simply discuss the nature of the way things happen. I mean, they don't happen by accident in many cases. They seem to have a pattern. They seem to be planned, and we could take a look at that, and we could take a look at why. My study of the assassinations was very political. It's a great chance to review American history, because you have to take a look at why would somebody want this person killed? What did they gain from it, and how did it change our political system or our way of life at the time they were killed? And there are some very interesting answers to that. You could take a look and glimpse slightly. You could lift the hood a little bit and see who might have gained by this. But we can't really know totally. So I just want to be careful about that.
Oh no, I understand that. Again, I'm not making any specific. I mean, look, the names I mentioned before. I mean, Jekyll Island. I mean, those are the names. I mean, you could, the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. There's another example. I mean, George Bundy, John J. McCloy. I mean, these are all Rockefeller frontmen. I mean, that's just basic fact. I mean, they all ran in and out of Rockefeller circles for decades leading up to that. So, look, I mean, it's not hard to infer, but I'll just leave it at that. I know you don't want to go there. But but again, it's just my
Right.
personal opinion, and I'll emphasize that the reason they have not, that's that word they quote our shadow government, or even the deep state, even Fox News has to admit there's a shadow government at this point. It's so obvious. But anyway, the reason they have not blown his head off in broad daylight is because I think they just can't get away with it. I mean, it's not like everybody's got iPhones. There's a lot of eyes, and plus Trump has his own security. For obvious reasons, but it's not like it was almost 60 years ago at this point. We had Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather or whoever. We had 2 or 3 networks to control, and they put out the government, the government propaganda, the Council on Foreign Relations and that whole crowd.
No, it's what we have now
put it
is
out.
much
It was
more
Lee Harvey
diversity
Oswald,
of
and that's the end of it. And Lee Harvey Oswald, I mean, he's dead. What within a day or so. Just so happened to break into the Dallas Police Department and shoot him dead, so he couldn't talk. And then the guy that shot him, Jack Ruby, I mean, he succumbed to cancer very silently in prison, so he was gone. And all of a sudden, everybody, it's wrapped in a bow tie, and it's history. It's just. But let's just jump back to the original, original point.
Okay.
That conversation, as far as biblically now, if we kind of split history, I mean, the most important person in history, the most popular, most famous person in history, like him or hate him, the most well known is Jesus Christ himself.
Yes.
Whether he was the Son of God, which I adamantly believe, or you just believe he was some scam artist, nobody can argue with that. This person existed, and he was the most controversial. Let's just use that word, person in history. But let's just look at his life. I mean, who did he? Going back to Matthew 21, and John chapter 2, I mean, who did he? I mean, he physically removed the money changers.
He did.
From the temple.
I think it was at that moment that
John
he was
did
crucified.
it with whips.
I mean,
Now,
when he went into the temple and he started because the temple had become completely corrupted, mainly by the Romans and by the Hellenized Jews who were running the deal back then. And he went in there with a sword and he started to drive them out. And it was within, I think, probably a day after that he was crucified. And one of the most interesting images of that was that when he was brought before the Roman authority, that being Pontius Pilate, and Pilate asked, "Who do you answer to?" And he said, "I answer to a higher authority." And that was the first time, I think, in world history that you had a person stand up to the enormous power of the state. And I mean, Rome, of course, was the empire that ruled the world back then. And for him to just stand there as one man and say, "Hey, I don't answer to you, I answer to a bigger authority," that was the beginning of dissent. It was the beginning of individualism in many ways. I mean, there are so many things we could look at, regardless of the theology. I mean, that's a religious question. But in a practical sense, there are so many things we could look at in his life that set certain trends that have really moved man forward in the sense of realizing who he is and what his potential is.
Sure. I mean, but just to with the money changers, I mean, from the standpoint of who he chased them out. Now this was a person who was asking, as he was being crucified, was asking forgiveness for the soldiers were pounding nails into his wrists and his ankles. He's asking them, for God to forgive them, but the money changers, he had no interest in forgiving. So that's a very, very interesting symbolism there in the context of our previous conversation, because, fundamentally, what were the money changers doing? I mean, I understand there's technical aspects, we got into a little bit, and we can go on for hours just talking about that, but fundamentally, what were the money changers doing? They were demanding that, there was a coinage that had to be used, to pay the temple tax, which they demanded, and they were having people turn in their legitimate money and exchanging it for coins that can only be used exclusively in a temple. So they were robbing people. They were using the temple to essentially do it, which is in principle is basically the same concept as our Federal Reserve System. I mean, look, whether you believe that the money should be gold backed or just issued, right, it really isn't the point. The point is that these were robbers, and in the same sense, our Federal Reserve System is they took the legitimate wealth of a country, for themselves, and they reissued fake debt in return.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that, in that it's a way of skimming profits off the top in an unearned way. I mean, when you have production, the currency should be a reflection of the production of a particular society. The money itself shouldn't be an item of profit. The money, a bank can lend
Sure.
money and make profit from interest, but the creation of the money should be neutral. It should be done simply, sure, as a service to the needs of a given country. So this whole system, I mean, if we're going to look at it broadly and philosophically, it is very regressive, and it does tend to put power in the hands of a few people, and it also has both political and social ramifications, because those people who have a mortgage on our property and our future, they also can manipulate our culture, and they can manipulate how we see things and make changes that reflect their interests. And that in and itself is probably the most troubling aspect of this.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, that's another. Let's just call the Federal Reserve System. Let's just compare it to an octopus. And I think we've even seen those cartoons. Actually, when we had a free and independent press before they were bought out by the international banking cartel. I mean, you can go back in early 1900s, look at history books, and you can see an octopus drawing, and octopus representing the Rockefeller clan and Morgan and Carnegie and the rest of them, kind of just taking over the United States. The Congress, Congress, as we mentioned before, was compromised easily, 1913. But it's very interesting. It's a very interesting point, because now what's another aspect, another arm of this octopus are the so-called tax-exempt foundations. That would be your Rockefeller Brothers Fund, your Carnegie Endowment, Ford Foundation. Today, that would be George Soros would be kind of a late add-in to that whole gang of and I mean gang as in like Al Capone, a gang of robbers, which is essentially what these people are. You go back and you look in our so-called colleges, and people are sitting there wondering, all these so-called great conservatives and these country club Republicans, Limbaugh and the rest of them are sitting there wondering, why are our colleges 98% liberal or so-called and socialist, and why are we turning out socialists? Hey, look, Chuck, it goes back to the same old thing in the old adage. I mean, just follow the money. I mean, don't try to just follow the money. And when you follow the money through the colleges and end up at the tax-exempt foundations, and there's your answer. Okay, and as a matter of fact, the Reese Commission back in the early 50s, and this is another book people can get on Amazon.com. It was a committee of Congress that ran parallel with the great Joe McCarthy, by the way, and that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's a whole book on this. It's called Foundations, Their Power and Influence, and you could read through there. And what they found is that these organizations that I just mentioned, they fund all these so-called colleges and universities. They took over the Ivy Leagues and with a liberal slant. And if you think about liberalism, and you wonder why would the biggest capitalists in the history of the world, why would they be so interested in establishing a liberal society? It's not really antithetical to what they are. It's actually exactly what they are, which is authoritarian, power-hungry megalomaniacs, and that's really at the bottom of at the end of the day, that's really what liberalism is. I mean, liberalism is education, industry, economy, production of food, healthcare, everything issued by the central authority, being the government. And if that sounds a lot like National Socialism or Nazism or communism or whatever you want to call it, that's exactly what it is. So that's why when you go above the level of all this nonsense about communism and Russian communism and socialism, and that you go above that, you'll find the international banking cartel was behind every one of those regimes. And I'm talking about communist Russia, I'm talking about Nazi Germany, I'm talking about liberal socialists, or whatever you want to call them, in America today. You find above that all, and another analogy, picture a pyramid, no pun intended, and that's really where the power structure is. As a matter of fact, when people doubt that, I mean, I have another book on my site. It's called The Un-American Genocidal Complex that traces this history. And in a particular case of Adolf Hitler, I mean, Adolf Hitler was made and produced right here in the United States. I mean, I'm just going to flat out say that, and that's not you saying it, for any. I'm saying it. I mean, that's basic historical fact. If you go back to the history, IG Farben and Ford and Standard Oil and all these other companies,
Right.
That's what the Nazi war. That was the backbone of the Nazi war machine. If there's no IG Farben, which was a spinoff of Rockefeller Standard Oil, and there's that name again, there's no Nazi war machine. If you think
I mean, Anthony Sutton, the Hoover Institute fellow, did a very good series of books on this topic. The Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, Wall Street and Hitler, where he shows the financial backing of these movements coming from, I wouldn't say the United States, but I would say certain international banking and finance groups. I mean, the Rockefellers actually maintained oil production in Germany even through the war. I mean, it was there is definitely a money trail on that one.
Sure. No, there's no doubt. And again, think about what I'm saying. And again, this is a historical fact. I mean, as you mentioned, Anthony Sutton, I think, is the author. You mentioned Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
He wrote a bunch of books, about that, and he's a source, not the only source, but I use multiple sources for my information, by the way. But he is a source of information on that. But yeah, you can go back and again, my top secret source for a lot of this information that I get is Amazon.com. I mean, if people would bother to pick up a book and and put down the Fox News and the other nonsense coming out of the idiot boxes, and now I guess the iPhones, they might learn something. And if you think about it, I mean, Hitler. I mean, if you compare National Socialism to modern American liberalism, then they're really not that much different. If you think about central authority controlling production of food, controlling industrial production, controlling education, controlling health care. It's not that much different than the so-called liberals. Okay,
well,
now of course they say Hitler was a warmonger and a murderer, but hey, again, Hitler, and you can argue with this, and I'll argue right back. I mean, but Hitler got all his ideas about eugenics and everything. He got that right here in the good old USA and England. Okay, now that's going back to Charles Darwin and evolution and survival
Darwin's
of the fittest.
That being Francis Galton, he coined the word eugenics, which means good life, and
good genes.
And they were very close collaborators, and the idea was to isolate and move away less evolved human beings and species of human beings, and but ultimately you could take a look at the classical dictionary definition of socialism, which, by the way, modern dictionaries have tried to tinker with but you could go back a few years. And what it is public ownership of the means of production, public ownership of communication, and public ownership of distribution. In other words, the state owns all aspects of your life. And when you have a state that's not operating in the constraints of a constitution and that's not elected to represent you, then that state operates as an agent toward an international order, or what we might euphemistically call a one world ant colony, where everybody becomes de facto equal. But anyways, Robert, I want to just briefly get into one more aspect before we wrap it up here, and that is that we talk about what President Martin Van Buren called the money power, and where its locus is. And my sense is that today, in our times now, the locus primarily is in China. And I think that the Chinese are going to be the future center of it. One of the pieces of evidence I would offer, besides the fact that they maintain still a very top-heavy communist system that allows for free market in order to make money, and that controls their own population through things like social ratings on their smartphones and other technologies, they have also pretty much seemed to have co-opted our big social networks, Google, Facebook, I believe also Twitter as well. And that we thought that when we got rid of the three networks as being the main source of news, we might have some freedom. You know, we had talk radio for a while. Then we had the internet for a while, which is what you and I are doing right now. And, I came into this thing with a certain idealism, thinking, oh, great, I could finally speak my mind and get my ideas out, even though I was nervous about, I assumed that wouldn't last forever. Well, it's not lasting forever because they are censoring, and they are taking their cues from China because they want to do business in China. And China has told them, you can't, you have to set up a system of censorship. And so they're doing that, and I think they're gradually going to import that here. And that is something that I think they probably resonate with as well, ideologically, because I think they set those networks up for free speech, mainly for people who think like they think, which is on the left. And they're scratching their heads of what are we going to do with the fact that there are alternative voices that are coming up and that they're having influence, and they're creating influence on elections. And now they're coming up with a means to censor us. So that, to me, is the future locus of the socialist experiment, and that being China. What do you think?
Well, sure. I mean, it's just, without getting into the whole China thing, I think, China was another, the Red Revolution, so-called, that was another setup by the international bankers. But I think what happened, and as happening in Russia, I think what's happening is China is kind of running outside the realm of the international banking cartel, and without getting into it, I think that's really the real source of the Battle of Armageddon. And let's not go there right now. But in a more specific sense, what's happening is, the Chinese are moving in. I mean, they're influencing our universities. I mean, of course, you had the whole Clinton Gore crime syndicate back in the '90s. Exchanging money, mysterious bags of money with Chinese monks, and stealing our technology and all this sort of thing. But like any authoritarian regime, just like Animal Farm, I don't know if they still read Animal Farm in school anymore. That's probably banned too, ironically enough. I mean, some people everybody is equal, but some are more equal than others. I mean, right. Thematically, that's socialism or communism. And we're open-minded as long as you agree with us. I mean, that could be another mantra of the so-called liberal left. So that's exactly what it is. They're just looking to crush dissent and crush opposing voices, just like the Roman / Jewish hierarchy did back in Jesus' day. He didn't never accept with the myths we mentioned about the money changers. He never raised a finger, but he was a dissenting voice peacefully, as he did it. But you just can't have dissent. The same. I guess to wrap this up, you can't have a free and open society as is stipulated by the United States Constitution, with an underlayment of morality, of course. I mean, most of the founders were devout Christians, because they understood you can't give people unbridled freedom. I mean, that's a logical train wreck if you think about it. I mean, then what's his, then Hitler, and if you have absolute freedom, and everybody's his own judge, then you end up with with Adolf Hitler and Charles Manson and these kinds of people. So of course you have to have an underlayment of basic civility and morality. But other than that, I mean, yeah, you want to decentralize power as much as you can from a central authority. And you do that, you just like they did in the Constitution. You spread the central power out amongst three branches of government, and you spread it out from those three branches to the states. I mean, and this is exactly what we're up against. This is exactly why the international banking cartel, which again sits above all these aforementioned communism, socialism, Nazism, sits above all that. This is why it hates. And again, I actually, Chuck, this is a good way to conclude. This gets back to the whole conflict going back to the Garden of Eden. This is why Satan hates God, and take my word for it. If you read the Old Testament, God hates Satan, and he hates all that follow him, and that's Old Testament. Maybe we can get into that on a future show if you're interested.
Absolutely.
But
Yep,
this is the conflict. Okay, this is, I guess, this will circle back and kind of conclude. This is when you go above these systems, which again are nothing more than man-made, man-controlled systems. Then you have God, which kind of gets into evolution. Why do these people hate God so much? Because with God, they don't get to rule. If there's no God, then the state fills in that power vacuum. And this is why liberals are so intent on the theory of evolution, which is the biggest scientific scam in world history, by the way, way bigger than the climate change scam.
I agree with that. It's the central tenet of their political faith, and it's the one thing that everything else springs from, and it cannot be questioned. Anyways, and I wrote a book about that too. I mean, I have like about 14 books, and I get the sense you do too, Robert. So
yeah.
You've got some good stuff here, Robert. Let our listeners here and viewers know how they can get copies of your books, where they can find out information about you. Give out whatever information you'd like to give out.
Okay. Again, thank you again for having me on. I appreciate it. And hopefully, we can do it again. But obviously, we can go on for hours here. But anyway, the website is boxofsunglasses.com. That's all in one word, and that's in honor of, again, my favorite movie. They Live. John Carpenter's They Live, and Roddy Piper finds the box of sunglasses and put them on him, because thematically that's exactly where I'm coming from. So you go on there, and then my books. I have 3 books for sale for PDF download or for Amazon. Pleased to meet you. The Un-American Genocidal Complex, which we talked about briefly, which documents Adolf Hitler made and financed here in the United States and England, and also They Live, Great Society of the Undead, which is a really big book that's available on the honor system for that. That's actually a free download. You can pay what you want for that, or get the bound copy on Amazon. Again, it's boxofsunglasses.com, and there's all kinds of videos, and I probably have another, I don't know, Chuck, maybe another 10 or 20 books further information just on that website, just really for PDF download. But I'd really appreciate it. I mean, I'm independent. Shows like this, I have to pay out of my pocket, so people could support me by buying at least 1 or 2 of the books.
Yeah, I'll put a link.
I really appreciate it. Keep me going. And God bless.
Absolutely, and I'll put a link up to the YouTube page, and that should give some help on that one. And look at Robert, you're a real truth teller, and I really appreciate talking with you this afternoon.
Yeah, Chuck, thanks for having me on, and we'll talk again.
All right, take care. Okay, I shall return,
God bless.
God willing, tomorrow at the usual time, 12 noon. Have a good afternoon, everybody.